Let's get into the show proper now. Acting Chairman of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, Ibrahim Magu, has again called for the repatriation of funds looted from Nigeria.
Ibrahim Magu also called for the extradition of persons indicted for corruption, such as the former Minister of Petroleum, Dizani Maduke, to face trial in the country. He lamented that despite efforts by the Nigerian government, the government of the United Kingdom has refused to budge.
On all the countries, not only UK government, in the US, where all the looters are hiding with our money, they should repatriate the money unconditionally and extradite those people who are staying there. Because, for instance, like Diziani, 3 years after, or 3.5 years after, we have not had anything from her. We have not had anything from the UK authority, though we have concluded investigation. We collocate, we work alongside with them on this investigation. So nobody can tell me that the investigation has not been completed.
Okay, EFCC chairman there, reeling it out as the case may be. All right, we had in 2015, rather, when he assumed office, President Muhammadu Buhari promised to fight corruption. Has he made progress, or does he need to do more work as far as that is concerned?
While some Nigerians believe the war has made some gains, others say it's selective. But the governing party, the APC, has described the anti-graft war as hugely successful.
In October 2015, the United Kingdom pledged her support for Buhari's anti-corruption war. Joining us to discuss the anti-corruption debate is a lawyer and National President, Committee for the Defense of Human Rights, Malaki Ugumadu. Malaki, good morning.
I'm delighted to be here. Good morning.
It's really nice to see you.
Thank you.
Right.
Glad to have you join us.
We'll be having Larry Suraj will join us as we get along. But on Skype, we have the Executive Director, African Network for Environment and Economic Justice, David Ugolo, joining us on Skype. David, good morning. It's good to have you join us right now.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay. Let's start from the studio. Well, Malaki, I must say, happy married anniversary.
Thank you.
Really interesting, I must say.
I think I'm gradually losing my identity to the public. Almost everything about me is in the public. Thank you for that.
Well, it's a beautiful thing anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, well, you've been following this corruption issues and human rights issues across Nigeria and across the world over the years. Right now, Nigerians are very divided as to rating the government or rating themselves, how well off they were when it comes to the corruption index in the country as at 2015 or before 2015, and then now. Remember, this government campaigned on a tripod, and corruption was one of the major things the government said that we're going to fight. How would you assess that fight against corruption for the past four years now, 4.5 years?
Well, I think first of all, please grant me the indulgence to congratulate my community, that is the human rights community, not just in Nigeria, but across the world.
Across the world.
Today is the International Human Rights Day.
Exactly.
Now, having said that, I do not, as a person, find it difficult to fathom the division you have described. It's not far-fetched. It is founded on certain conditions that are prevalent within our own society. It largely depends on where you are looking at it from and who is making the remark and assessment. Granted that the government rode on the crest of their promise and avowal to deal with corruption in the country. However, I must be quick in adding that I think that what has largely defined the perception and the division in terms of assessment has to do with the extent to which we traveled in the woods. We were too far in the woods regarding corruption, so much so that if there are minimal progress, you hardly would find people who would accept and believe in it. That is not to say that we have gotten it completely right or that there are no rooms or further rooms for improvement. It only speaks to the depth and the comprehensiveness of that challenge, which is to say that a people have become not just accustomed, literally attuned and wired to believe that corruption is not just here with us, but is part of us. And therefore, corresponding efforts to pull us out of that suffers a lot of hiccups, a lot of disbeliefs, a lot of misgivings. At the end of the day, what is important is to remain focused on the fight and then be able to measure the progress already made. And I make this point before I conclude on this. If you check section 15, subsection 5 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, 1999, it imposes a responsibility on government. That responsibility is to abolish all forms of corruption and abuse of power. Clear terms, section 15, section 5. Now, and it's contained in the fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy, to the extent that the same way the government has a responsibility under section 14 to ensure that the essence of governance itself is the security and welfare of Nigeria. It has an additional responsibility to fight corruption. Now, given the peculiarity of our situation, the exigency of our own time, it has become almost fashionable to preach the gospel of anti-corruption, as though it is not part of the responsibility of government. I make these points just to underline the point that for several reasons, it has become a huge concern to the Nigerian people. It has become part of us for a very long time, and it has become largely unbelievable when progress are made in that regard. Just a few days ago, and I saw you reel it out during your intro, the pioneer chairman of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, which is a leading anti-corruption agency in Nigeria, was honored not in Nigeria, not even in Africa, far away Malaysia. Now, that is a global acknowledgement that whereas there could be challenges, but there are clear indicators showing that the fight is on in this country, because Nuhu Ribadu did not dramatize the capacity he showed in Malaysia. He performed here.
Right here in Nigeria. Let's quickly bring in Executive Director, African Network for Environment and Economic Justice, David Ogolo, in on this discourse. Now, some say, David, that what we've successfully done in the past decade was to fight corrupt people and not fight corruption. And this is largely responsible for a situation where once you're with the ruling party or in the good books of the executive, you're exempted from being prosecuted when it comes to corrupt practices. Of course, we've seen high-profile cases go for years, 7 to 8 years, without precise conviction. What exactly do you think is going on here? We seem to have a system, where corruption, as it were, prospers, and then we're chasing a few corrupt people. What are your thoughts along this line?
Again, thank you, my friend. I completely, think that fighting corruption is not an easy task. It has its own challenges, but the most important thing is to continue to put all priority that would help, again, reinforce the message that corruption do not pay. And the implication of corruption is that we lose, and the victim are the very poor in the society. And the effect of corruption is what differentiates between country that is progressing and country that is retrogressing. And obviously, majority of people around the world wants to be in a country where there is progress, where there is prosperity, where there is development. And countries where you see corruption in a high level, you don't see all those things. And so in tackling corruption has become a global issue. But the reality in our own part of this world is that, particularly in Nigeria, is that fighting corruption has become very difficult, because obviously when you look, the context is a bit a challenge. We have our religious challenge, we have our ethnicity challenge, and then the level of ignorance in the society is also very high. So our political elite have taken advantage of these factors to create divisions and rather than building consensus around the fight against corruption. There is nowhere around the world that you tackle corruption without consensus, and unfortunately, that is missing in the fight against corruption. If you look, and you can compare this to when there is a football in the country and Nigeria is winning, you see consensus generated because of the enthusiasm for Nigeria winning the football. Then you also can compare that to the consensus that is built around Ebola. When Ebola broke out in Nigeria, there wasn't anything like PDP or APC or North or South or Muslim or Christian. There was consensus in tackling Ebola. But unfortunately, corruption hasn't received such kind of consensus, obviously because of the advantage it conferred on the political elite in the country. In moving forward, we're not going to have any point in time where we're going to have a neutral anti-corruption agency. I can tell you, even if PDP wins the election next year, the APC perhaps will lose the election, are going to also say that PDP is not fighting, or either way. So, and if you look from 1960 till date, no one ruling government has ever been in power that the opposition party will not accuse that they are being wish hunted. So I think we should learn lessons from it and do things differently in tackling corruption, particularly with the theme of this year, we must be united against corruption, because it's a threat to development. It reinforces all kinds of challenges. So the key message that I think we should be moving forward is that, yes, have we been very successful in tackling corruption in Nigeria? I will say that yes or no, because first, we don't know the extent corruption would have dealt with this country if we have not put it as priority. The real challenge now is that when anybody is arrested, when anybody is alleged to have been involved in a corrupt activity, the challenge should be, the burden should be upon that person to prove that I am not corrupt. The whole idea that I am from PDP, or I am from APC, or I'm from the North, or I'm from the South, will not help us in this country. And I think the media has got a great role to play, particularly the investigatory media. They need to begin to unpack all these issues, because there is not going to be any time you're going to have a neutral government. Every government that is in power do have interest. And because of this interest, somehow their approach in tackling corruption is colored. But the challenge for us in this part of this country, considering our own context peculiarity, is first, we must begin to identify those that have been identified to be corrupt. And then the prosecution that is going on, how to really increase efficiency. And then two, looking for more innovative way of fighting corruption. The idea of arresting people, putting people in jail doesn't solve the problem. And I think the issue of asset recovery is more important component of the anti-corruption crusade. Because why do people get involved in corruption? Because of the benefit. So if you put an anti-corruption framework in place that look after those assets and get it back, like what has happened in the case of the Abacha family. Now we have $322.5 million that is going to be distributed across the entire country. And victims of over 300,000 people will be benefiting from this. This is the better way to send a strong message that the norm that we normally accept as corrupt attitude can begin to change. The stereotype, all the attempt to undermine the fighting of corruption in the country will begin to change. That is the only way we can begin to move. So in the real sense of it all is that what has happened with the anti-corruption fight of the current present regime, there are success, there are failure, no doubt. But the question is that, can we incentivize the success story, and can we continue to support the success story so that we can see how we can begin to build consensus? I can tell you, the PDP, the APC political elite need to build a consensus around the tackling of corruption. For example, there is no way you can have an economic group. There's no way you can tackle poverty. There's no way you can tackle the Northeast crisis. There's no way you can fight the Niger Delta problem without tackling corruption. There is a correlation between the level of corruption today in the country and the crisis we're experiencing in the Northeast part of the country today. Okay. And even not even overcoming the challenge in the Northeast is also corruption. You have seen a situation where projects that are supposed to be meant for the Northeast program are going to private pocket. You have seen a situation where money meant for NDDC in the Niger Delta is going to private pocket. And who are these people? These are political elites from PDP and APC. So we shouldn't be deceived by either of all these political parties. They are all brothers and sisters when it comes to their interests. The most important thing is that it's for the people of Nigeria, the media, the civil society to begin to build consensus, particularly today as we celebrate the Human Rights Day. There is a global consensus of linking the human rights issues with the anti-corruption crusade, because for every public resources that is stolen, you deny people not to have a better life. And this is the real challenge in moving forward.
Okay, David, you said a lot of things which certainly we'll touch on as we get along. We still have with us Malaki Ugumadu with us in the studio. But let's go on a break and then we will come back to dwell on this. This is a topic that Nigerians are really very interested in, corruption issues. Stay with us on TVC Breakfast. All right, thanks for staying with us on TVC Breakfast. We've been talking about corruption and the fight against corruption. We have with us in the studio Malaki Ugumadu. He's the president and committee for the defense of human rights. We also have joining us on Skype the executive director, African Network for Environment and Economic Justice, David Ugolo. All right, Malaki, let me come to you on this. David said a lot of things which I like to draw something from. We all know that corruption is generally a perception issue. Until you get it, until you lay your hand, until there is evidence, until it is concluded by a court, it still remains a perception issue here and there. But this perception seemed to tend to become more of a negative perception from when people don't understand what is going on. And that brings us to the issue of secrecy. The government in Nigeria seems to be secretive about so many things, from NNPC even to appointments and so on and so forth. Do you think that is even where to start from? Being open, being transparent before we even talk about allocating resources and so on and so forth?
That's a very crucial question you have thrown up. And it goes to the heart of a proper analysis of the entire ramification of this crisis that we call corruption. My good friend and colleague, Mr. David, talks about the absence of consensus on the issue of fighting corruption. But I think there's a bigger absence, which is the absence of consensus around the implication of fighting corruption. Corruption, very bluntly, is existential in nature. It has the capacity to not just undermine our security, it has the capacity to terminate our existence politically. And if it is that bad, then there cannot be any effort to be spared in trying to tackle it. Having said that, he also talked about the asset recovery component of corruption. I mean, that, in my view, as he tried to say, serves the deterrent purpose. In other words, if you're going to indulge in this malfeasance, the ultimate benefit, illicit at that, is to get a lot of assets illegally acquired onto yourself. And if you're going to lose it, then what is the need for that? But I think that we must also look into other aspects of fighting this corruption. Yes, assets recovery, fantastic. What about the punitive strategy? In other words, you could recover and also dish out appropriate punishment. There are countries in the globe that do not give prison terms on corruption matters. There are some that have no option for fine, just so to ensure that that tendency, that culture of corruption will be nipped in such a way that people will be clear about the implication of indulging in corruption. Corruption attracts maximum punishment in places like China, and Singapore, I suppose, and so on and so forth. We are not advocating capital punishment, but we're saying that the punishment mechanisms should be such that will not just be commensurate. It will serve the purpose of deterrence in a way that people are not just slapped on their wrists or told to bring not up to 1% of what they have stolen. Now, you have that, but in my humble view, the most important aspect of fighting this corruption will be for a government to live up to its social responsibility. In other words, you must provide the socio-economic conditions that lead to these issues of corruption in the first place. What do you do with employment, gainful employment? What do you do with the creation of infrastructure? To what extent does the state provide social safe nets for the citizens, and so on and so forth? You will realize that quite a number of people, or the percentage of people who gravitate towards corruption, do that to a large extent because they believe it is their responsibility to fend for themselves. They do not see the state as having the capacity or mechanism of catering for them. You go
or
to
even the willingness.
You go to this, or even disposition. Look at a country like ours, where labor will consistently go on strike to be able to activate an existing law regarding increase in welfare or salaries, minimum wages. This is a country in which ASU would have at every time proceed on strike to be able to get government to respect an agreement that it has signed up to. So at that level and in that circumstance, what you find is that people are drawn to their natural instinct to fend for themselves, because as it is said, self-preservation is the first condition of humanity. So I make this point because we need to be a bit comprehensive in looking at all the ramifications of it. But the truth being that if you did nothing about fighting corruption, and genuinely so, what you're going to harvest is a catastrophic consequence that has a capacity to undermine that society. Nigeria has got enough dose of those activities. I'm talking of corrupt activity, from the survival and triumph of Boko Haram to the legion of violently oriented youths, to the deaths we record in our hospitals. All of them are related to corruption. There were moments in this country, and I'm sure it has not completely changed, even if there are efforts in that direction, where you were recording deaths on our roads, and people, easily termed it death traps, Those are functions of corruption, because if you go back to your budgets, preceding and current budgets, you will see that allocations have been made.
Provisions are made for all of those.
All of those. So there's a direct nexus between these and the quality of life that we live. I therefore would subscribe to the point you made earlier, that look, the issue of orientation should also be part of what we are doing. And orientation will not start or be effective when you target the adults, people who are no longer impressionable, people who have formed their habits and are unable to change, because they say a fool at 40 is a fool forever. There must be a deliberate effort to target children of this country. Unfortunately, as we do that, the failure of leadership in our country is producing people with diverse and different characters. We used to have, I know it's still there, but I choose to say that we used to have the National Orientation Agency, an agency whose responsibility is clearly cut out, that has the mandate to orientate our youths and then visit them at that impressionable age where they are in the primary,
such that we
and
can
elementary
instill in
stage,
them that
those values
and all of that. Let's bring David Ogola in very quickly. As highlighted by Malaki Ogumago, some have the opinion that poor remuneration is also a stimulant for corrupt practices, especially at the public sector. The logic is that how do you expect the current minimum wage of 18,000 naira, which even some governors have refused to pay, to take the workers home? And hence the culture of corruption festers. Aha, people, for instance, are preparing for Christmas and all of that. But do you think that a higher wage has the capacity to fight corruption, especially at the public sector level?
Well, first, again, I want to again greet my dear comrade and a very senior brother for his very apt analysis, again, that re-emphasized the relationship between corruption and the economic situation of individual or a country. Well, for Nigeria, in the context of Nigeria, there is no empirical evidence that point to the fact that if salary is increased, that will again tackle the kind of corruption we have in the country. I just give you an example. NNPC, for instance. The staff that work in NNPC, they earn very well. They get good salary. But unfortunately, the level of corruption in NNPC is unacceptable in any climate. Then, in those days, NITEL officials used to be like oil workers. But what happened? They were the most corrupt people. Then even the university you're talking about, the resources that have gone through the university, what is happening with it? The level of corruption in Nigerian university is, you can't describe it. There is a culture, you see, the norm in the society of, it doesn't matter how you become rich or what is the metrics for measuring your success, is the real challenge that we are tackling in the country. And the culture of impunity. You know, we commit corruption, people are involved in corruption, nothing happens. It's only when you steal bicycle or you steal motorcycle, you sleep with another man's wife, that's where you go to jail or you are in prison. That's why I completely agree with my brother that what is the consequence if you're committing corruption crime? It's something that we need to put in a balance, otherwise we won't be able to fight corruption. But most importantly, that I have said, is about the emphasis on recovery of assets. It's the most potent way to deal with the challenge we have faced today. And I'm happy that this year, World Anti-Corruption Day and then the Human Rights Day are refocusing their agenda of the need of the relationship between corruption and human rights. And then the broad-based movement that are working on this issue, they don't no longer need to work in silos. They need to come together. The human rights community, the anti-corruption community need to come together to build a common force, because there is a direct relationship between the human rights situation of a country and the corruption situation. If you look the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index and see the human rights situation in Nigeria, you can see correlation. For instance, young men and women and children that are migrating out of the country, and because of this, of lack of access to job, no doubt, but the challenge that we face in the country is that there is a culture that you have to be successful. How you become successful doesn't really matter. And those who are involved in corruption has now become an accepted norm. We need to challenge that norm. We need to challenge that paradigm. We need to look for a way to tackle the challenge. That's why, again, the Charterhouse report or the social norm become very relevant. Now, there were quite a number of policy recommendations from the Charterhouse report on the implication of social norm in our country. We dare not move forward with implementing policies that take into consideration the people's role. It will not be sustainable.
All right, David, I must thank you for all that. Malaki, let me come back to you. I remember in the early 80s when President Buhari was head of state, one policy that a lot of people applauded that time was war against indiscipline, and they know, or everyone knew that he, when it comes to corruption, was something that you couldn't have it at that time, even though there were complaints of human rights abuses. When he came in 2015, a lot of people saw him with that eye, saying that he has zero tolerance, in fact, minus zero tolerance for corruption. And if nobody was going to expect anything close to the perception of even corruption in the government. But one way or the other, in the government, we still heard of so many reports here and there. We remember the Koi Gate. We remember Babachi Lawal, former secretary to the government of the Federation. All the allegations that came up because they were not proven in court, so not yet. So certainly we all see them as allegations. But that is still part of the perception we're talking about. Remember his Executive Order 6 that came. A lot of criticism here and there, even though he wants to really tackle these issues. But do you see this government really taking that steps, practical steps, towards rooting out corruption, the way people perceived him when he came into power?
Well, there's very little you can do to completely dislodge a perception that has gained ground from concrete, practical situations. And I dare add that in addition to all that you reeled out in terms of corruption cases.
Okay. All right. My producer has told me we have to round off now because time is against us.
Oh, yeah.
Malaki Gumadu, President, Committee for the Defense of Human Rights. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And David Ugolo, the Executive Director, Africa Network for Environmental Economic Justice. Thank you for coming on the program as well.
Thank you.